The summer sun beat down on the historic palace grounds, where tourists from around the world gathered to snap photos and marvel at the centuries-old architecture. Among the uniformed guards, standing watch that afternoon was a young man who had served faithfully for 7 years. His black boots gleamed in the sunlight, and his uniform was pressed to perfection, every button polished, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. The guard stood motionless at his post, his eyes focused straight ahead as visitors posed beside him for photos. Children waved, trying to make him smile, while their parents adjusted camera settings and checked their tour guides. It was a typical afternoon, filled with the usual mix of excited chatter in dozens of languages, the click of cameras, and the tour guides' voices rising above the general buzz of the crowd. Just past noon, when the sun was at its highest and the temperature had climbed to uncomfortable levels, a different kind of tension began to build. A man wearing an expensive polo shirt and carrying a camera that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary started making his way through the crowd. At first, he seemed like any other tourist, taking photos and looking around. But there was something off about his behavior, a certain aggressiveness in his movements, a dismissive way of pushing past other visitors. The guard noticed the man's approach but maintained his professional stance. Years of training had taught him to stay focused regardless of what happened around him. He'd seen all sorts of tourist behavior, the silly poses, the occasional drunk visitor, the people who tried to make him laugh. But something about this man's energy felt different. The crowd continued their normal activities, but a few people started to notice the man's odd behavior. He was getting closer to the guard, making loud comments to no one in particular. His voice carried an edge that made nearby parents pull their children a little closer. A couple of teenage girls who had been taking selfies lowered their phones and exchanged worried glances. The atmosphere shifted subtly. The happy chatter died down as more people became aware that something wasn't quite right. An elderly couple who had been reading from their guidebook stopped and watched the scene unfold. A group of students on a school trip fell silent, their earlier laughter fading into concerned whispers. The guard remained perfectly still, his training evident in every rigid line of his posture. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, his expression neutral, but anyone watching closely might have noticed the slight tension in his jaw. He'd faced difficult situations before. It came with the job, but this felt different. The air seemed to grow thicker with each passing moment. Nearby, a street vendor selling ice cream stopped his cheerful sales pitch and watched the scene with growing concern. A young couple who had been planning their perfect photo opportunity slowly lowered their camera, their smiles fading as they sensed the changing mood. A tour guide who had been enthusiastically explaining the palace's history to her group paused mid-sentence, her trained eye picking up on the subtle signs of trouble brewing. The tourist crowd, usually a flowing river of movement, began to form small islands of stillness. People who moments ago had been strangers united in their growing awareness that they were about to witness something significant. A few reached for their phones, but not to take tourist photos anymore, their instincts telling them they might need to document whatever was about to happen. The palace grounds, which had been filled with the joy and excitement of vacation memories in the making, now held its collective breath. The guard stood at his post, a symbol of duty and professionalism, as the well-dressed man with the expensive camera moved ever closer, his intentions yet unknown, but his hostility becoming more apparent with each step. The sun continued to shine brilliantly on the palace stones. The flowers in the nearby gardens still swayed gently in the breeze, but the carefree atmosphere of a tourist attraction had transformed into something more charged, more serious. The guard's unwavering stance spoke volumes about his training and character, even as the situation around him began to deteriorate. Birds continued their songs in the nearby trees, oblivious to the human drama unfolding below. A light breeze carried the scent of the palace gardens across the courtyard, a pleasant contrast to the unpleasant scene that was about to unfold. The guard remained at his post, the very picture of dignity and restraint, as the first signs of trouble began to manifest themselves in the aggressive tourist's approaching footsteps. The tourist with the expensive camera began his attack with words that seemed to poison the air around him. His voice, loud and harsh, cut through the peaceful atmosphere like a knife. The man's face had turned an angry shade of red, matching the designer polo shirt he wore, as he started spewing hateful comments about the guard's skin color. Other visitors froze in place, shocked by what they were hearing. A mother quickly covered her young son's ears, while an elderly man gripped his walking stick tighter, his knuckles turning white. The beautiful summer day that had brought so many people together to admire the palace's history was now tainted by the ugly sound of hatred. The well-dressed tourist grew bolder with each passing moment when he saw that the guard wouldn't respond. He moved closer, his expensive shoes clicking against the cobblestones, waving his hands dramatically as if performing for an audience he imagined would support him. His camera, probably worth thousands of dollars, swung carelessly from his neck as he gestured wildly. "Look at him just standing there," the man sneered, his voice tripping with contempt. He continued his verbal assault, each word more shocking than the last. Some tourists backed away, while others stood their ground, recording the incident on their phones. The air felt heavy with tension, like the moments before a thunderstorm. The guard remained perfectly still, his training evident in every muscle that didn't twitch, every finger that didn't move. His eyes stayed focused straight ahead, looking past the hatred being thrown at him. Years of discipline showed in his stance, shoulders back, chin up, dignity intact. Vogie couldn't react. The slight tightening around his eyes told a story of inner strength that impressed everyone watching. A group of schoolchildren on a field trip huddled closer to their teacher, their young faces showing a mix of confusion and concern. The teacher, trying to shield them from the scene while also using it as a powerful lesson, whispered gentle words of reassurance. Her eyes, however, never left the unfolding drama, ready to move her students if things escalated. The tourist's behavior grew worse with each passing minute. He started walking in circles around the guard, like a schoolyard bully trying to provoke a fight. His expensive watch caught the sunlight as he gestured, his face growing redder with frustration at the guard's continued composure. The man's words became louder, more desperate for a reaction that wouldn't come. Nearby, a street musician who had been playing cheerful tunes for tourists stopped his performance mid-song. The silence made the man's hateful words echo even more clearly across the courtyard. An ice cream vendor slowly closed his cart, his usual happy calls replaced by a concerned frown as he watched the scene unfold. Tour guides who knew the palace's history couldn't help but see the irony. This building, which had stood through centuries of progress and change, was now witness to such a display of backwards thinking. They exchanged knowing glances, their usual scripted talks forgotten in the face of this real-life drama. The tourist crowd had completely transformed from their earlier holiday mood. People who moments ago had been strangers now stood united in their silent disapproval. A young couple who had been taking selfies now recorded the incident, their faces serious. An amateur photographer lowered his camera, deciding some moments shouldn't be captured for entertainment. The guard's stillness became more powerful with each passing moment. His silence spoke volumes, drowning out the tourists' hateful words with dignity. The sun continued to shine on his polished buttons and perfectly pressed uniform, creating a striking image of professionalism under pressure. Time seemed to slow down in the palace courtyard. The beautiful gardens surrounding them continued their display of colors, a sharp contrast to the ugliness of the moment. Birds flew overhead, unaware of the human drama below, their shadows dancing across the ancient stones that had seen centuries of both humanity's highest achievements and lowest moments. The tourist's voice began to crack slightly, his confidence wavering as he realized his words weren't having the desired effect. His expensive camera knocked against his chest as he moved, the lens cap dangling loose, all that costly equipment unable to capture the true value of the moment unfolding before him. His attempts to provoke a reaction were meeting a wall of dignified silence that seemed to grow stronger with each passing second. Something beautiful began to happen in the palace courtyard that day, something that would later be shared thousands of times on social media and discussed in living rooms across the world. As the angry tourist continued his verbal assault, the crowd of visitors began to change. What started as uncomfortable shuffling and worried glances transformed into something much more powerful. It began with a gentle-faced grandmother from Asia who didn't speak much English but understood exactly what was happening. She stepped forward, positioning herself slightly between the guard and the angry man. Her action required no translation. Her stern expression and crossed arms spoke volumes in any language. A tall businessman in a crisp suit, who had been checking his phone emails just moments ago, quietly pocketed his device and moved to stand near the grandmother. He didn't say anything, but his presence added to the human barrier that was beginning to form. His usual rush to his next meeting forgotten in this moment of needed solidarity. Two college students on their summer break, wearing bright tourist t-shirts and carrying backpacks covered in travel patches, joined the line. They had been taking silly photos just minutes earlier, but now their young faces showed a maturity beyond their years. Their smartphones were raised, recording the incident, making sure everything was documented. A family who had saved for years to make this trip from South America moved forward together. The parents guided their children to stand with the growing group, turning this ugly moment into a powerful lesson about standing up for what's right. The father's hand rested protectively on his son's shoulder, his tourist map forgotten in his other hand. The crowd continued to grow, forming a protective semicircle. People who couldn't understand each other's languages exchanged knowing looks and reassuring nods. A tour guide who spoke 5 languages began quietly translating what was happening to her group, her voice thick with emotion as she explained how people from different countries were coming together. An older man with a veteran's pin on his jacket slowly made his way through the crowd using his cane. When he reached the front, he stood tall despite his age, his military bearing evident as he took his place in the line. His wife handed him a bottle of water, which he passed to the guard's fellow servicemen standing nearby, a silent gesture of support. A group of teenagers who had been posing for social media photos earlier now used their phones for a different purpose, spreading the word about what they were witnessing. Their fingers flew across their screens, sharing the story of how a diverse crowd of strangers united against hatred. Their young faces showed a mix of anger at the tourists' behavior and pride in being part of this moment. A street artist who had been sketching the palace quickly captured the scene in his notebook, the still guard, the angry tourist, and the wall of humanity that stood between them. His quick pencil strokes caught the essence of the moment, ordinary people from all walks of life choosing to stand together. The angry tourist's voice began to falter as he realized the crowd wasn't on his side. His expensive camera hung uselessly around his neck as he looked around, seeing faces from every corner of the world staring back at him with disapproval. His ranting began to sound hollow against the powerful silence of united strangers. A small boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking innocent questions about what was happening. His mother knelt down and explained in whispers, turning this ugly incident into a lesson about courage and standing up for others. Other parents did the same, their children's eyes wide as they witnessed this impromptu demonstration of human decency. The palace grounds, which had seen centuries of history, was now witness to something remarkable. The beautiful gardens and ancient stones watched as people from different countries, cultures, and backgrounds chose to stand together. Tourist maps were folded away, guidebooks closed, and photos forgotten as ordinary people chose to become part of something extraordinary. The summer breeze carried the sounds of different languages as people quietly spoke to each other, forming connections that crossed borders and broke down barriers. Some shared water bottles in the heat, others offered supportive smiles to those around them. What had started as a typical tourist day had transformed into a powerful display of humanity's better nature. Sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest voices. As the crowd stood united against the angry tourists' behavior, a young girl with bright eyes and 2 missing front teeth watched everything from behind her parents. She wore a t-shirt with a unicorn on it, and her small backpack was covered in colorful pins from all the places her family had visited. The girl had been quietly holding her mother's hand, watching the scene unfold with the special kind of wisdom that sometimes only children possess. Her parents felt her grip loosen, and before they could react, she had slipped through the crowd like a tiny stream finding its way between rocks. Her father reached out to stop her, but she was too quick. The crowd, which had formed a protective barrier around the guard, instinctively parted to let her through. Something about her innocent determination made everyone hold their breath. The angry tourist, mid-sentence in his rant, didn't notice her at first. She walked right up to where the tourist stood, her small shoes making soft tapping sounds against the cobblestones. Her hair ribbons danced in the summer breeze as she tilted her head back to look up at him. The tourist's voice trailed off as he finally noticed her, this tiny person standing barely as tall as his waist. The palace courtyard fell completely silent. Even the birds seemed to stop sitting for a moment. The guard maintained his position, but anyone watching closely might have noticed his eyes flicker briefly toward the small figure who had stepped into this tense situation. The girl's voice, clear and innocent, broke through the tension like sunshine through storm clouds. "Why are you so angry at someone who's protecting all of us?" she asked, genuinely curious. Her words, spoken with the simple honesty that only a child can manage, echoed across the courtyard. The tourist opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. His expensive camera hung forgotten around his neck as he stared down at this small person who had somehow cut through all his anger with a single question. His face, which had been red with rage, now showed confusion. The girl's parents stood frozen, like all the other tourists, watching their daughter do something extraordinary. Her mother's hands were clasped together, her father's arm around his wife's shoulders. They had always taught their daughter to be kind and speak up for what's right, but they never expected her to demonstrate these lessons so powerfully. "He stands here every day," the girl continued, pointing at the guard, "making sure we're all safe so we can take pictures and learn about this place." She adjusted her unicorn backpack as she spoke, the little pins catching the sunlight. "My teacher says that people who protect others are heroes." A young couple who had been filming the whole incident on their phones lowered their cameras slowly, realizing they were watching something more meaningful than a viral video. The street vendor who had stopped selling ice cream wiped a tear from his eye with the corner of his apron. The tourist looked around at the crowd, really seeing them for the first time. Faces from every corner of the world, all united in support of the guard, all moved by this child's simple wisdom. His expensive watch caught the sunlight as his hands fell to his sides, no longer gesturing in anger. An old man in the crowd nodded approvingly, remembering his own granddaughter back home. A group of teenagers who had been recording everything for social media stood silent, their phones lowered, understanding that some moments are too precious to view through a screen. The girl's simple question hung in the air, changing the atmosphere like magic. The beautiful palace gardens seemed to come alive again, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of flowers across the courtyard. The angry words that had polluted the air just moments ago were replaced by the wisdom of a child. Her parents finally stepped forward to gently guide her back, but the damage, or rather, the healing, was already done. The tourist stood silent, his expensive camera and designer clothes suddenly seeming less important than they had moments ago. The crowd watched as the man's face changed, showing the first signs of something new, shame. The change that came over the tourist wasn't sudden like a light switch being flipped. Instead, it was more like watching a sunrise, slow, gradual, but impossible to ignore. The little girl's words had cracked something in his armor, and now the whole world could watch as reality seeped in through those cracks. His expensive camera, which had been bouncing against his chest as he shouted, now hung heavy like a weight around his neck. His designer polo shirt suddenly felt too tight, as if it was shrinking under the heat of 100 disapproving stares. The red in his face changed from anger to something else, the deep flush of shame. The tourist's eyes darted around the courtyard, really seeing the crowd for the first time. He saw the grandmother who had first stepped forward, her face lined with years of wisdom, still standing firm with her arms crossed. He noticed the businessman who had put aside his important phone calls to take a stand. He saw the teenagers who had stopped taking selfies to record his behavior, their young faces showing a maturity beyond their years. His gaze landed on the little girl's unicorn backpack as her parents gently led her back into the crowd. The colorful pins from different countries caught the sunlight, each one representing a place where people probably taught their children the same lessons about kindness and respect. His own voice from moments ago echoed in his head, and for the first time, he truly heard how it sounded. The guard remained at his post, still as a statue, professional to the core. But now the tourist saw him differently, not as a target for his anger, but as a person doing their job, protecting everyone, including the man who had just spent the last several minutes hurling abuse at him. The polished buttons on the guard's uniform reflected the sunlight, like tiny mirrors showing the tourist his own behavior. Around them, the palace grounds continued their daily routine. Flowers swayed in the summer breeze, birds flew overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a tour guide had resumed their historical explanation. But here, in this corner of the courtyard, time seemed to stand still as one man's worldview started to shift. The tourist's hands, which had been gesturing wildly just minutes ago, now hung limply at his sides. His expensive watch caught the light, reminding him of all the time he had wasted spreading hatred instead of appreciating the history and beauty around him. His mouth, which had been spewing venom, now trembled slightly as he struggled to process his own actions. A small child in the crowd asked their mother a question in a whisper that somehow carried across the quiet courtyard. "Is the angry man okay now?" The innocent question seemed to hit the tourist like a physical blow. He looked down at his designer shoes, now dusty from the cobblestones, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The crowd watched as the man's shoulders slumped, the anger draining out of him like air from a balloon. Some people had their phones out, but many had lowered them, recognizing that they were witnessing something more meaningful than a viral video moment. They were watching a person confront their own prejudices in real time. The street vendor who had stopped selling ice cream during the confrontation quietly resumed his rounds, but his eyes kept drifting back to the scene. The artist who had been sketching the palace added final touches to his drawing of the moment, capturing not just the scene, but the feeling of watching someone's perspective change before your eyes. The tourist took a step back, then another. His expensive camera swung uselessly at his chest as he looked around one last time. The faces in the crowd showed not triumph or mockery, but a mix of hope and expectation. They had witnessed his worst moment. Would they now see him choose a better path? The summer sun continued to shine down on the palace grounds, warming the ancient stones that had seen centuries of human stories unfold. But today they witnessed something special, a moment when a child's simple question managed to accomplish what no amount of anger or argument could. It made someone stop and really think about their actions. As the tourist began to back away from the scene, his transformation was evident in every movement. His earlier swagger had disappeared, replaced by the hesitant steps of someone walking on new and unfamiliar ground. The crowd remained silent, understanding that sometimes the most powerful changes happen in quiet moments of realization. The next morning dawned clear and bright over the palace grounds. The early sunlight touched the ancient stones, creating long shadows across the courtyard where yesterday's drama had unfolded. The guard stood at his post, as unchanging as the palace itself, while the first tourists of the day began to arrive. Nobody expected to see the man with the expensive camera again. These kinds of stories usually ended with the angry person disappearing, leaving only viral videos and shocked comments behind. But sometimes life surprises us with better endings than we expect. Just before noon, a figure appeared at the palace entrance. It was the same tourist from yesterday, but he looked different. Gone was the designer polo shirt, replaced by a simple button-down. His expensive camera was nowhere to be seen. In his hands, he clutched an envelope and what looked like a small paper bag. The regular crowd of tourists parted slightly as he walked through, some recognizing him from social media videos that had already spread across the internet. A few pulled out their phones, expecting another scene, but something about the man's demeanor was different today. His steps were hesitant, his head slightly bowed. The guard's fellow serviceman, standing nearby, noticed the tourist's approach first. His hand tightened slightly on his weapon, ready for any trouble. But the tourist stopped at a respectful distance, his body language showing nothing but regret. "I'd like to wait," the tourist said quietly to another guard, "until his shift ends, if that's allowed." His voice, so full of anger yesterday, now trembled slightly. The other guard studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. The tourist took a seat on a nearby bench, the envelope held carefully in his hands. For 3 hours he waited patiently. Tourists came and went, taking photos, listening to tour guides, creating their vacation memories. Some recognized him from yesterday and whispered among themselves, pointing discreetly. The tourist stayed in his spot, occasionally wiping his forehead in the summer heat. When the guard's shift finally ended, the tourist stood up slowly. His hands shook slightly as he approached the guard, who was now standing with his fellow serviceman. The envelope crinkled in his nervous grip. "I wrote this last night," the tourist said, holding out the letter. "I couldn't sleep, kept seeing that little girl's face, hearing her question." His voice cracked slightly. "But a letter didn't seem enough, so I also—" He held up the paper bag. "It's coffee. For you and your fellow guards, though I understand if you don't want it." The guard, now off duty and allowed to speak, looked at the man for a long moment. The tourist's face showed nothing but genuine remorse. Slowly, the guard reached out and took both offerings. "I've never done anything like that before," the tourist continued, his words coming faster now, like a dam breaking. "I was angry about something else entirely, problems at work, my divorce, but that's no excuse. When I got back to my hotel, I watched the videos people had posted. I couldn't believe that angry man was me." A small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance, watching this unexpected sequel to yesterday's drama. The tourist didn't seem to notice them. His eyes were fixed on the ground as he spoke. "My daughter saw the video," he said quietly. "She called me this morning. She was crying, asked me if that was really her dad acting that way. She's about the same age as that little girl with the unicorn backpack." His voice caught on the last words. The guard listened silently, his face showing no emotion but his eyes alert and watchful. His fellow guards stood nearby, witnessing this moment of humility and truth. "I can't take back what I did," the tourist said. "But I want you to know I'm truly sorry. That little girl was right. You stand here protecting everyone, including people who don't deserve it. Like me yesterday." He paused, gathering himself. "I'm going to do better. Be better. My daughter deserves that. Everyone deserves that." The summer breeze carried the scent of flowers across the courtyard as silence fell between them. The tourist had said his piece. Now he stood waiting, understanding that forgiveness wasn't owed to him, that some actions leave marks that can't be easily erased. Stories have a way of taking on a life of their own, spreading like ripples in a pond, touching lives far beyond their original moment. What happened at the palace that summer day could have remained just another viral video, watched and forgotten? Instead, it became something much more meaningful. The video of the angry tourist had indeed spread across social media, but it was the second video, the one of his return and apology, that truly captured people's hearts. News channels picked up the story, not for its conflict, but for its message of change and hope. They focused on the little girl's question that started it all: "Why are you so angry at someone who's protecting all of us?" A week after the incident, the palace noticed something different about their visitors. Tourist guides began incorporating the story into their talks, pointing out the exact spot where it happened. "This is where a little girl's wisdom changed someone's heart," they would say, and visitors would pause, looking at the cobblestones with newfound respect. The guide's story became part of the training program for new palace guards. During orientation, senior officers would share the incident as an example of how dignity and professionalism in the face of hatred could lead to unexpected transformations. Young recruits would stand a little straighter, understanding the true power of their position. The tourist kept his word about becoming better. He started volunteering at community centers in his hometown, sharing his story with others struggling with anger and prejudice. "I was that guy," he would tell them, "the one in the viral video being horrible to a palace guard. But thanks to a child's question, I'm not that person anymore." Local schools began using the incident as part of their anti-bullying programs. Teachers would show both videos, the confrontation and the apology, to help students understand how words can hurt, but also how it's never too late to change and make things right. The little girl with the unicorn backpack became a symbol of standing up for what's right, even when you're small. 6 months later, a children's book appeared in stores, telling the story through colorful illustrations. The author, who had been in the crowd that day, worked with child psychologists to craft a message about kindness and courage that young readers could understand. The book's final page showed a diverse group of people standing together, with the palace in the background. Tourist shops near the palace started selling small pins showing a guard's hat and a unicorn, a subtle reference that connected those who knew the story. Visitors would spot these pins on backpacks and jackets, sharing knowing smiles with strangers who understood their meaning. The grandmother who had first stepped forward to stand between the guard and the tourist wrote about her experience in her local newspaper back home. Her article, translated into multiple languages, spoke about how age and language barriers mean nothing when standing up for what's right. "I didn't need to speak English," she wrote, "to understand that hatred needed to be answered with unity." A year later, the palace hosted a special exhibition about the history of its guards. Among the displays of uniforms and ceremonial weapons, they included a small section about that summer day. The guard's uniform stood in a glass case, alongside photographs of the diverse crowd that had united to support him. A small screen played interviews with visitors who had witnessed both the confrontation and the apology. The little girl who asked the question that changed everything returned to the palace with her family on vacation the following year. Now a bit taller, with her front teeth grown in but still wearing a backpack covered in pins, she found herself being recognized by the palace staff. The guard, now a trainer for new recruits, broke protocol just once to give her a small salute. Social media periodically resurfaces the story on its anniversaries, but not for the outrage that usually drives viral content. Instead, people share it as a reminder that change is possible, that one small voice can make a difference, and that it's never too late to choose a better path. The palace itself, which had stood for centuries witnessing countless human dramas, added this story to its rich history. Tour guides now point out 3 things to visitors: the changing of the guard, the crown jewels, and the spot where a child's question helped transform hatred into hope.